Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. The year was 1847, when parish records in Concordia began documenting a pattern that authorities would later attempt to erase from official memory. Across the sprawling cotton plantations along the Mississippi River, enslaved men were dying under circumstances that defied the usual brutality of the time. The victims bore no lash marks, no signs of hanging, yet their bodies told a story of profound violence. At the center of these deaths stood a single man, an overseer named Cyrus Halleck, whose weapon was neither whip nor rope, but his own bare fists, and whose 3-year reign of terror would end only when he encountered the son of his very first victim. To understand how this horror began, we must travel back 3 years to the spring of 1844, when Greenwood Plantation in Concordia Parish hired a new overseer whose reputation in the bare-knuckle fighting rings of New Orleans preceded him like a dark shadow. Cyrus Halleck, a man of Irish descent, born in 1810, had spent his youth in the brutal world of riverfront violence, where men fought without rules for money and pride, and where his fists had earned him both notoriety and a dangerous sense of invincibility. On a humid April morning, during his first week at Greenwood, Halleck encountered an enslaved man named Isaac during a field inspection, a man whose intelligence and quiet dignity seemed to challenge the new overseer's authority in ways that words never could. What transpired in the isolated stretch of land beyond the cotton gin would be recorded in a coroner's report discovered in 1923 by a graduate student researching antebellum mortality records, a document that clinically listed heart failure as the cause of death, while witness accounts buried in plantation journals told of something far more sinister. From the quarters, Isaac's wife, Ruth, 7 months pregnant and unable to intervene, watched as her husband was led away by Halleck, and though she could not see what happened in those final moments, the way Halleck returned alone, brushing dirt from his hands with a cold satisfaction, told her everything she needed to know about the monster who had just entered their lives. Between the death of Isaac in April 1844 and the winter of 1845, 3 more enslaved men at Greenwood Plantation would meet their end under circumstances that plantation records attributed to the mundane tragedies of agricultural life: a fall from a wagon, a sudden seizure in the fields, complications from what was termed a pre-existing weakness of constitution. Yet when Dr. Patricia Newcomb examined the medical journals of Dr. Clement Broussard in the Concordia Parish archives in 1967, she discovered notations that painted a starkly different picture, descriptions of rib fractures inconsistent with falling injuries, internal hemorrhaging that suggested repeated blunt force trauma to the torso, and damage to organs that the physician had noted, with careful professional language, seemed the result of systematic physical assault rather than accident or natural decline. Dr. Broussard, who served multiple plantations in the parish and whose discretion was apparently valued by the planter class, never formally challenged the official narratives, yet his private medical notes preserved observations that would remain hidden for over a century, creating a documentary record of violence that the perpetrator himself likely never knew existed. What remained visible to Broussard's contemporaries, however, was the remarkable effectiveness with which Halleck maintained order at Greenwood Plantation, a effectiveness that owner Edmund Fairchild enthusiastically praised in correspondence with neighboring planters. A letter dated January 1845, discovered among the Fairchild family papers donated to Louisiana State University in 1943, demonstrates the mechanisms by which Halleck's services became sought across the region. The letter reads in part that Fairchild had found in Halleck a man of uncommon capability, who understood the necessity of firm discipline and whose presence alone had resulted in improved productivity and a marked decrease in what Fairchild termed insubordination and malingering among the workforce. Fairchild went on to recommend Halleck without reservation to his correspondent, noting that while the overseer's methods were perhaps more physical than some might prefer, the results spoke to an undeniable effectiveness that justified any squeamishness about his approach, and that any planter seeking to maximize efficiency while maintaining proper order would do well to secure Halleck's employment. The true horror of Halleck's methodology would only become clear decades later, when formerly enslaved people gave testimonies during Reconstruction-era interviews conducted by the Freedmen's Bureau and later by historians documenting the lived experiences of those who had survived the peculiar institution. A man named Josiah Matthews, interviewed in 1868 at the age of 63, provided an account that would be corroborated by at least 7 other witnesses across different parishes, describing how Halleck would manufacture disputes over minor infractions, a tool left in the wrong location, an imagined slight to his authority, a moment of perceived hesitation in following an order. Halleck would then propose what he framed as a fair resolution, a physical contest between himself and the accused, fought away from the oversight of plantation owners or other white witnesses, usually in isolated sections of the property near equipment sheds, in clearings beyond the tree line, or in the hours before dawn when most of the plantation still slept. Matthews recalled that Halleck moved with the precision of someone who had studied the craft of inflicting maximum damage while maintaining an appearance of legitimacy, targeting the ribs, the kidneys, the solar plexus, areas where catastrophic internal injury could occur, while leaving the skin largely unmarked. Another testimony, given by a woman named Sarah Devereaux in 1872, described watching from a distance as her husband was led away by Halleck and returned barely able to walk, dying 3 days later from what the plantation physician recorded as internal complications of unknown origin. The genius of Halleck's approach, if such a word can be applied to such depravity, lay in his creation of plausible deniability, a framework wherein deaths could be attributed to natural causes, to the inherent fragility that racist medical theory ascribed to enslaved bodies, to accidents that occurred during what Halleck would characterize as legitimate disciplinary measures, or to pre-existing conditions that convenient post-mortem examinations would invariably discover, allowing him to move from plantation to plantation with recommendations rather than suspicion, his reputation as an effective disciplinarian growing even as the body count mounted. Between the spring of 1845 and the bitter winter of 1846, Cyrus Halleck's employment history traced a disturbing path across the cotton country of northeastern Louisiana, moving from Greenwood Plantation to Oak Mere, then to Bellwood, followed by brief tenures at Twin Oaks and finally Magnolia Heights, each transition occurring after a period of several months, during which plantation ledgers recorded deaths among the enslaved male population at rates that, when examined collectively by researchers in the 20th century, formed a pattern too consistent to attribute to coincidence or natural mortality. The reconstruction of Halleck's movements required piecing together fragmentary records from multiple sources, employment contracts that survived in parish courthouses, death certificates filed with local authorities, plantation account books that noted the financial loss when enslaved workers died and had to be replaced, and the invaluable discovery in 1889 of a leather-bound journal kept by Caroline Whitmore, the wife of the owner of Twin Oaks Plantation, found in the attic of what had once been the Whitmore estate during its conversion into a boarding house. Mrs. Whitmore's entries from October and November of 1846 provided a rare glimpse into the atmosphere that Halleck's presence created, observations recorded by someone with the privilege of literacy and the inclination toward documentation. Her journal entry from October 18th noted that the new overseer, Mr. Halleck, possessed an unsettling quality that seemed to affect the temperament of the entire plantation, that the enslaved men moved with unusual wariness in his presence, and that even her husband had remarked upon Halleck's cold efficiency, though he seemed pleased with the results. A later entry from November 3rd described her unease at witnessing Halleck escort one of the field hands toward the equipment barn, noting something in the man's expression that haunted her, though she could not articulate why. That same man, identified in plantation records as Benjamin, would be recorded as deceased 4 days later, the cause listed as a farming accident. By the close of 1846, when researchers would eventually compile the documented deaths across Halleck's various employments, the count had reached 15 men, each death officially explainable, each tragedy bureaucratically processed, and the pattern visible only to those who would look back across the decades with the knowledge of what they were searching for. Ruth gave birth to her son Solomon in July of 1844, 3 months after Isaac's death, bringing a child into a world that had already demonstrated its capacity for sudden and irreversible cruelty. And though she had no formal education and could neither read nor write, Ruth possessed a fierce intelligence and determination that would manifest in ways that only became clear through the discovery of a remarkable collection of letters found in the archives of the Amistad Research Center in New Orleans in 1978. These letters, dictated by Ruth to a free woman of color named Marguerite Dufresne, who operated a small shop near the river, and who quietly performed the dangerous service of recording and transmitting messages for enslaved people who had managed to maintain contact with loved ones across different plantations, revealed not only Ruth's maternal devotion, but her systematic effort to gather information about the man who had killed her husband. The letters, spanning from 1844 to 1847, demonstrated Ruth's connection to an informal network of communication that existed among enslaved communities across the parish, a network through which news traveled with surprising speed despite the restrictions and surveillance that governed their lives. In a letter dated March 1845, Ruth dictated her relief that the man she referred to only as the fighter had moved to a plantation some distance away, though she noted with horror that word had reached her of 2 deaths at his new location that bore the same characteristics as Isaac's. Another letter from September 1845 revealed Ruth's growing understanding that Halleck's violence was not an isolated incident, but a pattern, and she expressed her determination that Solomon, who was learning to walk and whose resemblance to his father grew more pronounced with each passing month, would somehow be kept safe from the fate that had claimed Isaac. By early 1846, Ruth's letters took on an almost strategic quality, discussing her efforts to ensure that Solomon remained assigned to work near the main house rather than in the fields, and describing with careful detail the skills she was teaching him, not merely how to avoid notice, but something else, something the letters suggested, but never explicitly named, as though Ruth understood even then that survival might eventually require more than invisibility. The extent to which the planter class not only tolerated, but actively facilitated Halleck's reign of terror became undeniable through the examination of correspondence preserved in the Louisiana and Lower Mississippi Valley collections at Louisiana State University, letters that revealed a level of complicity far beyond passive ignorance or willful blindness. A particularly illuminating exchange from the winter of 1846 involved 3 prominent plantation owners, Edmund Fairchild of Greenwood, Theodore Ashworth of Oak Mere, and James Pemberton of Riverside, discussing in remarkably frank terms the possibility of sharing Halleck's services on a rotating basis to maximize what they termed his unique ability to maintain proper discipline and extract maximum productivity from their respective labor forces. Fairchild's letter, dated December 3, 1846, proposed that Halleck could spend 3 months at each plantation in sequence, and suggested that his compensation should exceed standard overseer wages given his exceptional results, noting with barely concealed satisfaction that productivity at Greenwood had increased by nearly 30% during Halleck's tenure, despite, or perhaps because of, what Fairchild described with careful euphemism as the unfortunate but necessary reduction in the workforce through natural attrition. Pemberton's response, dated December 18th, expressed enthusiasm for the arrangement, and acknowledged that while some might question the occasional losses that seemed to accompany Halleck's employment, the economic benefits could not be disputed, and that maintaining order in these challenging times required men willing to employ whatever measures proved effective. The correspondence continued through early 1847, with detailed discussions of financial arrangements, schedules, and veiled references to Halleck's methods that demonstrated these men understood perfectly well the nature of the violence occurring on their properties. They spoke in the coded language of businessmen, discussing an uncomfortable but profitable arrangement, referring to firm discipline, necessary corrections, and the maintenance of proper authority, all phrases that masked their knowing participation in systematic murder. Their complicity rendered clear not by explicit confession, but by the careful way they avoided explicit confession, creating a documentary record that simultaneously revealed and concealed the truth of what they were sanctioning. Understanding the man behind the violence required assembling fragments from disparate sources, beginning with notices in the New Orleans Daily Picayune from the 1830s that mentioned a fighter named Cyrus Halleck competing in the brutal bare-knuckle matches that occurred along the riverfront wharves, contests that attracted gamblers and spectators seeking entertainment in the spectacle of men beating each other bloody for purses that rarely exceeded a few dollars. Cotus, records from Orleans Parish revealed that Halleck had been brought before magistrates on at least 3 occasions between 1832 and 1838 on charges related to assault, though each case had been dismissed or resulted in minimal penalties, suggesting either the victim's inability to pursue prosecution or the court's general disinterest in violence among the lower classes of the city. Halleck's early life, reconstructed from baptismal records at St. Patrick's Church and immigration documents, showed he was born in 1810 to Patrick and Siobhan Halleck, Irish immigrants who had arrived in New Orleans, fleeing famine and seeking opportunity in a city that offered Irish laborers little beyond backbreaking work and contempt from the established American and Creole populations. The world of riverfront fighting provided Halleck with something his immigrant origins had denied him, a realm where physical dominance could be proven absolutely, where his fists could establish a hierarchy that society otherwise refused to acknowledge. What emerged from the observations of plantation physicians who encountered Halleck during his years as an overseer was a portrait of a man who seemed to select his victims according to a particular criterion, a pattern noted in the private journal of Dr. Clement Broussard, who wrote that the men who died under Halleck's supervision were invariably those who possessed qualities that might be termed leadership, intelligence, or skill, men who commanded respect among their peers, or who demonstrated competence that exceeded mere obedience. Broussard speculated, in an entry that suggested the physician understood more than he was willing to state publicly, that Halleck seemed threatened by any display of capability or dignity that challenged the absolute degradation that the system of slavery required, and that his violence served not merely to maintain order, but to eliminate anyone whose mere existence suggested the possibility of something beyond subjugation. By the early months of 1847, something in Halleck's behavior had shifted, whether from growing confidence in his immunity from consequence or from some internal acceleration of the violence that had always driven him. The frequency of deaths under his supervision increased with alarming rapidity. Between January and April of that year, 6 enslaved men would die across 3 different plantations where Halleck held temporary positions, their deaths occurring at intervals of mere weeks rather than the months that had previously separated his victims. Witness testimonies collected during the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration's Federal Writers Project, part of an effort to record the experiences of formerly enslaved people before that generation passed entirely from living memory, provided devastating accounts of how Halleck's methodology had evolved to include increasingly transparent fabrications of wrongdoing. He would accuse men of stealing tools that would later be found exactly where they belonged, of insubordination for perceived failures to respond quickly enough to orders, of laziness for taking water during work shifts, each accusation serving as pretext for the challenge to physical combat that inevitably followed. The most harrowing testimony came from Josiah Franklin, interviewed in Natchez, Mississippi in 1936 at the age of 91, who described with remarkable clarity, despite the passage of nearly 9 decades, the morning in March 1847, when Halleck accused his younger brother Nathaniel of damaging a plow blade and demanded satisfaction for the offense. Josiah recalled being ordered to remain where he stood as Halleck led Nathaniel toward the tree line, watching helplessly as the 2 figures disappeared into the shadows of the oak grove, hearing sounds that he could not bring himself to describe in detail even after all those years, and then seeing Halleck emerge alone some 20 minutes later, wiping his hands on a cloth while Nathaniel's body would be discovered hours later by other workers, the official cause of death recorded as heart seizure. The terror that Halleck inspired had become pervasive across the enslaved communities of the region, his name spoken in whispers, his presence at a plantation creating an atmosphere of dread that affected even those not directly in his path. The pattern that had remained obscured for over a century would finally emerge into historical consciousness through the meticulous work of Dr. Patricia Newcomb, a social historian at Tulane University, who in 1981 was conducting research for a comprehensive study of mortality rates among enslaved populations in Louisiana's plantation districts. While examining boxes of unsorted documents in the Louisiana State Archives that had been donated by the estate of a deceased antiquarian collector, Newcomb discovered a leather-bound account book that had once belonged to a slave trader named Marcus Thibault, a ledger that recorded not only transactions and prices, but also detailed notes on the health, skills, and prospects of the human beings he bought and sold across the lower Mississippi Valley. Among Thibault's entries, spanning from 1845 to 1848, were notations about plantations that showed unusually high mortality rates among prime male workers, observations that Thibault recorded because such deaths affected the market value of enslaved people from those estates and influenced his calculations about where to source his inventory. In 3 separate entries, Thibault explicitly named Cyrus Halleck as a factor contributing to these elevated death rates, noting in one passage dated February 1847 that planters employing Halleck seemed willing to accept the loss of valuable property in exchange for the discipline and increased productivity that his presence brought, an economic calculation that Thibault observed with the cold analysis of a merchant tracking market conditions. This discovery prompted Newcomb to begin cross-referencing death certificates, coroner reports, plantation ledgers, and employment records across multiple parishes, an investigation that revealed 29 deaths of enslaved men that could be connected through documentary evidence to periods when Halleck held overseer positions at specific plantations. The pattern had remained hidden for so long, not through any sophisticated conspiracy, but through the banal mechanisms of bureaucratic fragmentation and indifference. Records scattered across different parishes and archives, deaths attributed to various proximate causes without any institutional interest in identifying common factors, and a historical establishment that until relatively recently had shown little inclination to examine closely the violent realities that undergirded the plantation economy. Through the careful manipulation of circumstances that required both determination and strategic thinking, Ruth managed to ensure that young Solomon was assigned to work in the gardens surrounding the main plantation house rather than in the cotton fields where overseers like Halleck typically concentrated their attention and violence. The letters Ruth dictated to Marguerite Dufresne during Solomon's early childhood revealed a woman engaged in a long-term strategy of survival, explaining in an 1851 letter that she had cultivated a reputation for skill in growing vegetables and medicinal herbs, making herself valuable enough to the plantation mistress that her request to have Solomon assist her in this work was granted, keeping the boy visible to the white family while teaching him the essential art of being present without drawing notice, of working diligently without displaying the kind of capability or independence that might attract dangerous attention. Solomon himself, in testimony given to Reverend Marcus Webb, a historian for the African Methodist Episcopal Church who traveled through Louisiana in 1902, documenting the experiences of formerly enslaved people, described his mother's careful instruction in what he termed the practice of invisibility, the ability to move through spaces occupied by white people as though he were merely another piece of the landscape, useful but unremarkable, competent but not threatening. Yet Ruth's preparation extended beyond mere survival tactics, as her letters alluded to arrangements she had made for Solomon to receive instruction from an elderly man named Marcus Thibodeau, a free person of color who lived on the edges of the plantation district and whose past Ruth never fully explained in her correspondence, but whose knowledge she considered essential to her son's future. Solomon's 1902 testimony provided more detail, describing how, beginning around age 7, he would slip away on Sunday afternoons when plantation work paused for the Sabbath, meeting Thibodeau in a clearing deep in the woods where the old man taught him things that had nothing to do with gardening or submission, teaching him, instead, how to read the intentions in another man's movements, how to protect vulnerable areas of the body, how to strike with precision rather than wild emotion. Lessons that Solomon understood only gradually were connected to the shadow of violence that his mother tracked with such careful attention across the plantations of the parish. In June of 1847, the convergence that Ruth had dreaded for 3 years finally occurred when Thomas Beaumont, owner of Riverside Plantation in Concordia Parish, hired Cyrus Halleck as his new overseer, a decision recorded in plantation employment ledgers and enthusiastically described in a letter Beaumont wrote to his brother Charles on June 8th, a letter that would be preserved in the Beaumont family papers and later donated to the Louisiana Historical Society. Beaumont's correspondence revealed that he had specifically sought Halleck's services after hearing recommendations from Edmund Fairchild and James Pemberton, both of whom had praised Halleck's ability to address what they termed discipline problems among enslaved workers, and Beaumont explained to his brother that Riverside had experienced what he characterized as an unacceptable level of insubordination and inefficiency that required a man of Halleck's proven capabilities to correct. Ruth and Solomon had been sold to Riverside 2 years earlier, in 1845, following the death of the previous owner of Greenwood Plantation, an event that Ruth had initially viewed as providential since it placed distance between her son and the man who had killed his father. But that hope dissolved on the morning when word spread through the quarters that a new overseer had arrived, and Ruth heard the name Cyrus Halleck spoken in hushed, fearful tones by those who had heard stories from other plantations about what that name signified. The arrival itself, witnessed by dozens of enslaved people who had gathered for the morning work assignments, was later described in testimony as a moment when fear became almost tangible. Halleck arriving on horseback with his few possessions, his physical presence immediately commanding attention. A man of perhaps 37 years, with the build of someone who had spent a lifetime using his body as a weapon, scanning the assembled workers with an expression that suggested he was already cataloguing them, already identifying those who would require his particular attention. Ruth, standing with Solomon near the garden fence, felt the careful architecture of safety she had constructed over 3 years collapse in an instant, knowing that the monster who had killed Isaac now shared the same 100 acres where her son worked and slept. Halleck's methodology at Riverside Plantation followed the pattern he had established across a dozen previous employments, beginning with a period of observation during which he moved through the fields and work areas with deliberate slowness, studying the enslaved population with the cold assessment of a predator selecting prey from a herd. Within the first month of his arrival, 2 men would die under circumstances that plantation records attributed to causes that seemed, on their surface, entirely disconnected from violence, one from what was termed a sudden apoplexy while working in the cotton press, another from injuries sustained in what was reported as a fall from a wagon hauling timber. Ruth understood with terrible certainty that these deaths bore Halleck's signature, and she redoubled her efforts to keep Solomon within the relative safety of the garden work, though the demands of harvest season and the plantation's labor requirements made complete avoidance impossible, forcing Solomon into the fields for cotton picking, where Halleck's presence was most concentrated and most dangerous. The psychological warfare that Halleck waged proved as effective as the physical violence, his mere presence creating an atmosphere of dread that affected productivity, even as it inspired the kind of desperate compliance that Thomas Beaumont interpreted as improved discipline. The diary of Beaumont's daughter Emily, a leather-bound journal discovered in 1945 during the demolition of what had been the Riverside Plantation House, provided a rare perspective from within the Planter family on the changes that Halleck's arrival brought. Emily's entry from July 12, 1847, noted her father's satisfaction with the increased efficiency in the cotton fields and his frequent comments about how Halleck had solved the discipline problems that had plagued the previous overseer's tenure. Yet Emily herself recorded observations that suggested a deeper unease, describing in an entry from July 19th an encounter when she had walked near the equipment shed and seen Halleck standing perfectly still, watching the workers in the distant fields with an expression she described as reptilian, a coldness in his gaze that had frightened her in ways she could not articulate, making her hurry back toward the main house with a feeling that she had glimpsed something fundamentally inhuman. The moment that would determine whether 3 years of careful preparation had any meaning occurred in late August of 1847, when the demands of cotton harvest required every available worker in the fields, pulling even Solomon from his usual garden duties to join the lines of people moving through the rows with picking sacks. Halleck, making his rounds on horseback in the oppressive heat, passed near where the boy worked, and something in Solomon's profile, a particular angle of the jaw or the set of the shoulders, caused the overseer to rein his horse to a stop and stare with an intensity that several witnesses would later recall. What Halleck saw was not Solomon himself, but the ghost of Isaac, the resemblance between father and son pronounced enough that even across 3 years and the transformation of memory, the connection registered in Halleck's consciousness, though whether he consciously recognized the boy as the son of his first victim, or simply saw in him an echo of a face he had once destroyed, remains unclear. Solomon's own testimony, given in 1902 to Reverend Webb, described the days following that initial moment as a period of mounting dread, as Halleck began finding reasons to appear wherever Solomon was working, watching him with an attention that felt predatory, asking questions about his age and his abilities, manufacturing small criticisms about his work that seemed designed to establish grounds for future confrontation. Ruth's final letter to Marguerite Dufresne, dictated on August 30th, 1847, carried the weight of someone who understood that the long-delayed reckoning had finally arrived. The letter, preserved among Dufresne's papers and discovered in 1978, read in part that Ruth had done everything within her power to prepare Solomon for what was coming, that she had no illusions about Halleck's intentions now that he had noticed the boy, and that she had instructed her son to remember everything Marcus Thibodeau had taught him, to trust in the skills that the old fighter had passed down, and to understand that survival sometimes required becoming the very thing that civilization pretended didn't exist within civilized people, a capacity for violence that matched the violence directed against them. On the morning of September 3rd, 1847, Cyrus Halleck confronted Solomon near the cotton gin in an isolated section of Riverside Plantation, accusing the boy of stealing a tool from the equipment shed, an accusation that multiple witnesses would later testify was entirely fabricated, the tool in question having been observed in its proper location both before and after the confrontation. What followed was reconstructed through the testimonies of at least 4 people who watched from varying distances, through Solomon's own detailed account given decades later, and through the coroner's report that would struggle to reconcile the physical evidence with the official narrative that would eventually be constructed. Halleck, following the pattern that had served him through 28 previous murders, challenged Solomon to settle the matter through physical combat, leading him away from the main work areas toward a clearing partially obscured by equipment and cotton bales. What Halleck did not know, what he could not have known, was that the elderly man who had trained Solomon for 3 years was Marcus Thibodeau, a name that would have meant everything to Halleck had he learned it earlier, as Thibodeau had been a legendary figure in the New Orleans fighting rings during the early 1830s, one of the few men who had ever defeated a younger Cyrus Halleck in sanctioned combat, a defeat that had contributed to Halleck's eventual departure from the city. Thibodeau had taught Solomon not merely the mechanics of fighting, but the psychology of it, how to read an opponent's assumptions, how to use an enemy's confidence against them, how to channel rage into precision rather than wild emotion. The fight itself, by all accounts, lasted less than 5 minutes and was brutal in its one-sidedness, though the direction of that brutality reversed every expectation that Halleck's experience and adult strength should have guaranteed. Solomon, 8 years old, but carrying 3 years of focused training and the accumulated fury of 29 deaths, including his father's, moved with a speed and technique that witnesses described as shocking, avoiding Halleck's initial assault and responding with strikes that found their targets with devastating accuracy. The official record of Cyrus Halleck's death, filed with Concordia Parish authorities on September 4, 1847, stated that the overseer had suffered fatal injuries as the result of an accidental fall near the cotton gin, a conclusion that required the complicity of multiple parties who understood that a different narrative would create complications far more troublesome than the death of a single overseer. Thomas Beaumont, calculating the legal and social difficulties that would arise from acknowledging that an enslaved child had killed a white man regardless of the circumstances, chose the path of bureaucratic expedience, a choice made easier by unexpected testimony from his own daughter Emily, who stated in a deposition that she had witnessed Halleck slip on loose boards near the gin platform, her lie preserving Solomon's life even as it buried the truth of 29 murders beneath official documentation. Solomon was not punished, not prosecuted, not even formally questioned beyond the minimal inquiry that Beaumont's version of events required, though the cost of that survival would become clear through the documentary fragments that emerged across the following century and a half. Ruth disappeared from Riverside Plantation records within weeks of Halleck's death, sold or transferred under circumstances that the ledgers did not clearly specify, her fate remaining unknown despite extensive research by historians who recognized her crucial role in the narrative. The gradual exposure of the truth required the accumulated efforts of researchers across decades. Dr. Newcomb's 1981 discovery of the slave trader's account book, the examination of coroner reports and death certificates, the analysis of witness testimonies collected during Reconstruction, and the WPA interviews, each piece adding to a puzzle that would never be entirely complete. The final revelation came in 2003, when a letter dated April 1872 was discovered in the archives of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, written by an elderly Solomon to an abolitionist correspondent, in which he described the burden of carrying the memory of 29 deaths and questioned whether his act of survival and revenge had brought any form of justice or had simply added another name to the accounting of violence that the institution of slavery had made inevitable. A question that the letter left unanswered and that history itself seems unable to resolve.